Hi everyone, my name is Pavitra Mahamani. I am a senior software engineer in test at Couchbase, and today in my session I will walk you through XDCR tips, tricks, and best practices. So if you've been using Couchbase, then you're most likely already familiar with XDCR, and this session will help you possibly reconfigure the way your setup is today based on the new features that have been introduced in Couchbase Server 7.0. And if you are just browsing or you're new to Couchbase or XDCR, then we will do a few setups. So you will be able to go and replicate those setups in your environments. So stick around. There's something for everyone. And I hope this will be informative. So let's dive right into it. The classic what, why, how, XDCR. So XDCR stands for Cross Data Center Replication. And as you know, in the course of the pandemic, I think our definition of data center has undergone a massive change. We are starting to think of it as an ecosystem of resources rather than one or two specific types of infrastructures. And organizations and teams are starting to think more on the lines of applications and their workloads. And we're bringing these to the network rather than the other way around. And XDCR has a key role to play in this migration of your applications. And the way it does it is by replication. So replication is the process of copying data across your server instances. And as you can see, I've kept it very generic. I'm not saying copying data from one primary to another secondary instance because you can lay out your Couchbase server instances in as complex a topology as you may need. And XDCR will still function across those instances. And most people do data replication to enable high availability, to do backup, archival, and or disaster recovery. So let's delve a little bit into why you should be using XDCR. You could be replicating your data on your on-premise VMs or containers. And while this might seem redundant, this is a great way to implement a hot standby system. And you will be able to see high performance even though you are doing writes and replicates in parallel because your instances are co-located on the network. And if you want to do replication to a cloud, that is still possible. So the advantage of replicating to the cloud from an on-premise resource is you can do on-demand scalability on your target cluster based on your loads, and there is no long-term commitment. If you decide to pause your XDCR for a while, then you don't have any commitment, and it's a good way to separate your server instances for fault tolerance. So if something goes wrong in your home network, power cut, or any other systemic failure, you still have your standby on the cloud ready to jump in. And then you can also replicate between cloud instances. One reason why you would want to do this is so that you can bundle your end users, your applications, and your data in the same zone. The advantages of doing this is, you might not see any improvement latency-wise, but you will definitely be able to personalize the data for your target audience. And you can also define scopes for your data, like a local scope and a global scope. And that can further help you with, defining your data locality. And obviously, there is flexibility in terms of cloud providers. you can set up XDCR between your instance on, let's say, AWS and GCP or Azure and so on. So there is no, you don't have to restrict yourself to any cloud provider when you're deploying Couchbase servers or setting up XDCR. And I also want to mention about how you can set up managed replications using the Couchbase Autonomous Operator and Capella, which is our self-managed cloud, fully managed cloud offering. And so we're done with the what and the why. Now let's talk about the how. So for all that XDCR does, the semantics of setting up XDCR are very simple. All you need to do is, once you've decided on your source and target clusters, you need to define a reference to the target cluster in the source cluster. And rule of thumb is you need to have a route. You need to be able to access the target cluster via an IP address and a port number. And yeah, that's the only rule of the thumb actually. And you configure replications from buckets on the source cluster to buckets on the target cluster. So we will look into this step in detail over the next few slides about how to set up a reference and how to set up a replication. But I do want to just mention that with Couchbase Release 7.0, it is now possible to also specify which collections in your source target need to be mapped to which collections in your target bucket. Right? And this is also something which we will get into in a minute. So let's look at some Couchbase XDCR setups, and hopefully this helps you to replicate these setups in your environment. So the very first one is an on-prem setup, very simple. As you can see, let's start here. So if you're new to Couchbase, then you can, once you've installed your instance, you can point your browser to the IP port, and you will be redirected to this UI console, and you can create or use your existing buckets. And this is where we will set up the remote cluster reference, and you can set up the replications. So if you look here, when you create a remote cluster reference, you are required to provide a name. This is like a tag, and then the IP or the host name and the port, and also the credentials needed to access your target cluster. Right? And then similarly here, when we set up a replication, we can specify which bucket, source and target bucket we are replicating. Right? So now let's, so the only criteria here is when you are on the same network, when you're on premises, then you already have a route from the source to the target. So this is a very simple setup. Let's look at something a little more interesting. Let's look at a cloud instance. So this is my EC2 instance, where I have XDCR running. And in this XDCR setup, I have connected my AWS instance to a Capella instance. And you can see same parameters again. This happens to be a secure connection. So I have enabled that, and I have provided the root certificate. And as far as the replication goes, you can edit it, delete it, you can pause it and resume it as needed. And then now let's look at a Capella instance. So Capella has its own UI console. This is our fully managed DBaaS offering. So let's sign in. And you can see I have one healthy cluster. So again, these are all things that you need to configure before you can set up XDCR. So in my cluster, so this is the cluster that I created inside Capella. And this is a self-managed EC2 instance. So this is the same EC2 instance that I just showed you previously. And I have added it in this console as a self-managed cluster. And my cluster that is present inside of Capella is running on AWS. Right? And so once you add clusters here, you can add as many clusters as you want. They can be hosted on any environment. You can also connect to a container or an on-premise VM. And once you have this, then you can set up the replications. Right, so let's go back to our cluster. So yeah, this is where I needed to go. So here we have our replications, and we have set up a replication from this cluster on Capella to the EC2 instance. This happens to be a bidirectional replication, if you notice. So replications can be unidirectional or bidirectional, which is pretty neat. And again, you can pause, resume, edit, delete. And finally, let me also show you one instance of, so both these nodes are in the same Kubernetes cluster that is managed by the autonomous operator. And you can set up, if they are on the same cluster, Kubernetes cluster, then you can use the Kubernetes DNS, internal DNS, and connect them, connect the clusters with XDCR. If you are on different Kubernetes clusters, then you will have to set up DNS server forwarding. So these slides and the setups that we went through just now are talking about XDCR interoperability. So we are able to set up XDCR in an infrastructure agnostic manner. And another cool thing is that once you set up XDCR, you can independently scale your source and target clusters. So you can add more nodes, you can upgrade your cluster to a higher or lower version of Couchbase. So it's very seamless and very convenient. Right, so quickly, just a quick recap of what we just saw, the setups that we just saw. So we are able to, if you want to use your containers, then you need to make sure they have a public IP. And one way to do that is by using the host network mode. There are other ways to do this. If you are setting up XDCR between containers on the same host machine, then you can just use the bridge. So there is no issue there. And then if you are connecting from on-prem to a cloud instance, then you would use the public IP and public DNS names of the cloud instance to create the remote cluster reference. You also need to enable all the ports, open up all the ports needed for Couchbase in your cloud instance in order to have the communication set up. And cloud to cloud, like I said, you need to set up a site-to-site VPN or a VPC if you are talking between cloud instances. And if you are on the same virtual network, you can use private IPs and internal DNS. And there's one more neat thing you can do. You can set up alternate IP addresses for your cloud instance. This is a great way to secure your instance. You can have one internal IP and one external IP and have the XDCR remote reference created using the external IP and port. And then with Capella, we could see that, we were able to create a managed cluster, add a self-managed cluster, and then set up the XDCR. And if you want to set up for any on-prem clusters, you would have to whitelist the public IP and add it again. And finally, we have a replications tab to manage all your replications. We spoke about the autonomous operator, the two different setups you would need as per your environment. So with that, we're still talking about how to set up XDCR, and the first topic we covered was how to create the remote cluster reference and the replication. So continuing in that vein, let's talk about the collection support for XDCR that is new in Couchbase version 7.0. So if you've been attending other sessions, you've probably heard scopes and collections being thrown about everywhere. So this is new, and this allows you to organize your data inside of your buckets into two more hierarchies. So you can group your data by scope and collection. So this is the actual data that your application will access, right? And with this, we now have the option of not only setting up the replication between the bucket 1 on your source cluster A to bucket 2 on your target cluster A, but you can also specify what collections get mapped from source to target. So the cool thing is that implicit mapping will happen automatically. So if you have same names for your collections on your source and your target, then the data will start flowing immediately when you create your application. As you can see, we have bucket 1 with scope A collection A and bucket 2 with scope A collection A. And so these two collections are implicitly mapped, and there is no need for you to do anything else unless you do not want to implicitly map these. For that, there is a workaround. But I just want to mention here, if you can see, we have a collection B on the source, but we don't have a corresponding collection on the target. So in this case, the data will not be mapped because there is a missing namespace. So I just want to demonstrate that here. So the target, the source bucket has all of these scopes and collections, but the target bucket does not have these. Target bucket only has this scope, inventory scope, and then the default scope and collection. So you will see errors here, which are notifying you that the destination collections are missing and will not get replicated too. So this is again your option. I mean, you can configure it and create these missing collections on the target, or you can choose to ignore these notifications if you don't want the data to go there. So let's switch back. So you also have the option of doing explicit mapping. So where you can specify exactly which collection on the target the source needs to replicate to. You can use rules to do this. And finally, you have the option of using the migration mode. which is, let's say you are on a pre 7.0 cluster, then your data will automatically be in a default scope and collection. And so now you can specify rules to say how that data needs to be populated into a 7.0 cluster where you've already pre-created the buckets with the scopes and collections. So this is a great way to migrate from a pre 7.0 to a 7.0 version of Couchbase. So with that, we have survived this session, and we are going to walk away with two things. The first one is that XDCR can be configured across any Couchbase server deployment, irrespective of what platform you've chosen to deploy it on. And XDCR now supports named collections. So previously 6.5 and up, we had default scopes and collections, but now we have named scopes and collections, and you can set up XDCR with implicit, explicit, or migration mode enabled with Couchbase 7.0. So I hope this has been useful. Like I said, if you already have XDCR set up, then you should be thinking about how to migrate to scopes and collections, because it is definitely more optimized to have XDCR set up with your collections. And if you are new, then I hope you have some ideas now about how to go about setting up XDCR in your setup. And we just touched upon a lot of these topics. If you want to delve into them in detail, I have provided a list of references. And if you want to contact me, that's my email ID. Thank you so much.